What excites me very much about Dr. Galston is not only that he is the interim dean of the School of Public Policy at State of Maryland, or also that he has been the assistant to the president of this country in relation to domestic policy, but that he is an independent thinker who feels that the liberal democracy is perhaps not liberal enough, that we need more space, more places for autonomy, more room for the citizenship to operate within the political system. I don't want to go too far because I can already see that Bill is dissenting from what I'm saying.
Not at all.
Not at all. Okay, great. But I'm very excited about this because I think he may approach this by especially a dialogue with liberalism, but not something which is other than an invitation to all of us to join in his ideas. Dr. Galston.
My prepared written paper has been circulated to the participants in this conference, but I have to tell you, I was so stimulated by what I heard this morning and already in this afternoon session that I will present only a small portion of my written remarks in order to deal with some of the very important questions that have already arisen, in order to promote a real dialogue. And I'd like to begin by engaging three of the questions that Professor Nasser put on the table in his opening remarks. He asked, who is authorized to formulate a political philosophy for contemporary Islam? I don't know what the answer to that question is, but I do know one thing. As a non-Muslim, I am not authorized to do that. I will speak as an external observer with an independent point of view, and only you can judge the extent to which my remarks are relevant for the great tasks that confront you. The second question, and here perhaps I will be somewhat more contentious. Professor Nasser raised the question, who rules, God, the people, or some combination of the two, both? And in some sense, I think Ayatollah Zanjani said both. And the question is how they are to be correlated or brought together. But to someone listening to this dialogue, from my perspective, the idea that God is among the rulers raises an important question, which is a practical question and not just a theoretical question, namely, if God rules, who speaks for God in the act of ruling? Who speaks for God? And this is, it seems to me, inevitably a political question. The question of who speaks for God is not simply a theological question. In the real world in which we live today, it is a political question. Now, you may say, well, God speaks for God because God has spoken through the enunciation of law. It is absolutely correct to say that that is a fundamental proposition that Judaism and Islam have in common, which distinguishes them both from at least a mainstream interpretation of Christianity. And that advances the argument, but only one step down the road, because as everybody who's engaged in this enterprise knows, God's law does not cover all conceivable instances, and there are a multiplicity of cases where the interpretation of the law is an absolute necessity. And so then the question is, who can authoritatively interpret and apply God's law today? It's not a simple question. If it is possible to identify a prophet who is perfect, or if it is possible to identify a political leader who is rightly guided in accordance with that prophecy, then once again there is no problem. But if we are not so fortunate as to live in times of that sort, then the question of who interprets the law is a very difficult question. And the question of whether there is a single locus of interpretation or whether the ability to interpret the law is distributed, perhaps through the entire population. Perhaps we are all partners in the interpretation of that law. These are questions that have to be considered. The third issue that stimulated me very much from Professor Nasser's discussion this morning has to do with the sources of governmental legitimacy. Now, this is an issue that has been debated not only in the world's great religions, but also in secular political philosophy in the West and elsewhere. And what I would like to do very briefly is to transform that question slightly and to ask, what are the criteria of legitimacy? What are the things that we can look for to recognize a legitimate government and also when a government is not legitimate? And here are some practical proposals to begin to think about that question. First of all, and here this is a tradition that goes all the way back to Aristotle, a legitimate government is one that honestly seeks to serve all of the people and not just some of the people. A legitimate government is one that genuinely respects the rights of minorities, and in reality and not just in theory. There's a third criterion about which I'll talk somewhat more extensively when I get to a piece of my paper, and that is that a legitimate government is one that respects the claims of the conscience of each individual. And we must try to understand what the conscience of an individual consists in. And finally, and we've already had some discussion on this point as well, a legitimate government is one that accords full and equal citizenship to all of the members of the society, regardless of their religious differences. And we've already had some discussion of the Iranian constitution in that context. Now, in a very important exchange or intervention this morning, Ayatollah Damad this morning, and in his own way, Ayatollah Zanjani just a few minutes ago, distinguished quite clearly between Islamic democracy and liberal democracy. I think this is the heart of the matter, or if not the heart of the matter, quite close to the heart of the matter. And so, with the permission of the chair, I'd like to say a few words about that subject as well. And here, let me introduce a set of distinctions that may clarify that very fundamental issue. It seems to me that that in considering this question, there are really three different issues. Issue number one is what the source of the government is, and its claims to a basis that gives it legitimacy to rule. And in the Western tradition, there are many answers to that question, some of which are religion. And the Declaration of Independence of the United States does not just talk about secular principles, it also talks about religious principles as the basis of political authority. It's not just the laws of nature, natural laws, the Catholics would put it, but also nature's God, that is, the being who authored those laws. And our founding documents are very explicit on that point. The second issue has to do with the structure of government, the arrangement of its institutions. Is the ruling authority the people as a whole, democracy in some form, kingship, a single-party government, a limited number of parties? These are all questions of governmental structure. And here again, there is a rich discussion throughout the Western political tradition, and until very recently, democracy was by no means unanimously approved by leading thinkers or even by a majority of those thinkers as the best form of government. There are defenses of kingship, of aristocracy, of theocracy, and many other possibilities. Third, and this I think will get us to the point of difference and of controversy, There is a question as to the scope of government. Does government cover all matters, or does it cover only a certain defined range of questions, leaving other questions to the authority or determination of non-governmental bodies? Now, the essence of liberal democracy, as I understand it, is that there are certain matters that are by theory and morality as well as practice outside the scope of government. Because this is a process of dialogue, and because I have already learned so much in the course of these first few hours, what I would like to do is to try to return the favor and to insist on 2 points. First of all, liberal democracy is not the same thing as secular democracy. Liberalism is one thing, and secularism is another. And those 2 concepts are frequently confused in Western thought and in this country, and not just overseas. Liberalism, properly understood, stands for a certain kind of relationship between religion and the political order. It does not stand for the critique of religion, the abolition of religion, or the marginalization of religion, either in civil society or for purposes of political discussion and dialogue. The second point I would like to make, and this is of very great practical importance, is that appearances to the contrary notwithstanding, the United States is not a secular society. Anything but. The United States is, as a matter of fact, is by far the most pervasively religious of any Western society. The great sociologist Max Weber 100 years ago predicted that as Western societies became more modern, they would become less religious. He was right about Europe. He was wrong about the United States. And so the question of religion and politics is not principally an issue between the United States and the Islamic world. It is an issue within the United States. That is the great political contest in the United States today over the appropriate role of politics in the determination and direction, rather of religion in the determination of the direction of politics. The United States is a deeply religious society, and any American sociologist would agree with me. They would disagree as to the meaning of that, but they would agree on that point. But they would also agree on a different point. And that is, although we are a deeply religious society, we do not have a single dominant religion. And that raises for us, but not only for us, I would say, the question of how political institutions are to deal with religious differences. And I would like to submit, for the purposes of this conference, that that is a very fundamental issue facing all of us in different ways. How does a political order deal with religious differences, whether it's a majority dealing with a minority, or whether it's a multiplicity of religions, no one of which commands the majority in the state. And I was very much, struck by a quotation from Ayatollah Aragi's written paper this morning, a quotation from the Quran, which I will repeat, although I'm sure that half the people in this room know it by heart, because you were trained to know it by heart. But here is the way it reads in English. We have given a law and a way of life to each of you. Had God wanted, he could have made you into one nation, but he wanted to see who are the more pious among you. Compete with each other in righteousness. All of you will return to God, who will tell you the truth in the matter of your differences. Now, what strikes me as so important, at least potentially about that quotation, is that it provides a basis for talking about differences of religion in the here and now as opposed to the hereafter. Now,